Indiana Disability History Project, Center on Aging and Community, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University.
Okay, so we're going to start off with you telling me your name, where you're from, and from where you retired.
Okay, I'm Paul Shankland, presently from Indianapolis, and have been for some 30-some years. And I've retired from the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities.
Okay, and how and when did you get into this line of work?
1964. I was working in a shoe store. Hated it. Had a very aggressive manager, and I was getting more return customers than he was, and he didn't like that because I wasn't as aggressive as he was. Anyway, somebody said, well, there's these kids over at the state school that need somebody, they're looking for somebody to help them learn how to play. I said, learn how to play? Are you crazy? I said, that sounds a lot better than this. So I went over and applied, and had a short interview with Don Beeler, and went away feeling like I was supposed to come in Friday for some kind of a initial signing up, you know, and then start work maybe. Well, I got a call on Ash Wednesday, and you know what this means to the shoe industry. We want you here Friday, you start work Monday. That was so good. Anyway, I wound up spending from 64 to about 71 working full-time or part-time as a recreation aide or activity therapy aide, and working mostly with the younger children. And that's from there I went to a local agency for a year, and then to the state.
Okay, and I thought you had worked at Fort Wayne State Hospital. Is that what
Yep.
you're talking about? Okay. What can you tell me about that experience? What was it like
Sure.
for you? What was it like for the people that lived there?
Well, I started out, when I said state school, it was Fort Wayne State Hospital. And the experience is a lot different in retrospect than it was when it was being lived. When it was being lived, it just was what it was, and I didn't know a lot that I know now. And I can say that while at the time I had a lot of fun, and the kids that I was working with, and then eventually adults that I was working with, mostly had a lot of fun when we were together. Maybe mostly. But in fact, overall, it was pretty miserable for the folks that lived there. And today it's one of the things that I try not to think about too much because it makes me too sad to think about the things that I was part of and saw there, the mistreatment, people encouraged to mistreat each other.
Can you elaborate?
In some ways I'm afraid to.
I should take that paper too.
Yeah.
I was about ready
Yeah. To go into much detail is a little scary because of some of it's just too hard to do. But the head of security was an abusive person, and I watched him abuse people. And I remember a guy, great big guy, who was physically in mostly pretty good shape. And his name was Paul, and he liked me because my name was Paul, and he was always, hey, Big Paul! But then I watched that security guard, or the head of the security for the institution, would be in a canteen or something, and he'd come up to him, and supposedly being friendly and whatnot, would start punching him. And there's nothing I could do about it. At the time, even at that time, in that milieu, when most people didn't think much of that, it upset me a lot, but there was nothing I could do about it. They segregated the people with Down syndrome for no reason that I can understand. at the same time, they had. I actually have video if you're interested from the camp, the summer camp of groups of people up there, and there were a lot of events that at the time everybody thought, oh, gee, isn't this nice that these folks can do this? And we had dances, and I remember I pulled a surprise on my late wife by showing up for one of the dances in a tux. And there were a lot of really, at the same time, in terms of staff, there were a lot of really wonderful people, really good, sweet people participating in an absolutely horrible milieu. And it only takes later advances to be able to look back and see how bad it was.
Well, one of the reasons we're doing this is so that down the road, people that don't know about life in institutions
Mm-hmm.
don't get the bright idea to create institutions.
Yes.
So we are trying to capture some stories and capture some reasons why they were bad places, even though the intention in that time was good. And to talk about lessons learned and why we never want to go back there. And people have talked about abuse and the part that you're talking about in that it was commonplace.
Oh, yes.
And that it was, basically no one did anything about it.
No.
That's really hard to understand. And imagine a person who is brand new and has never even thought about that, how they could believe it. So if you could kind of maybe set the scene a little bit more.
Yeah.
So
well,
that
some of the it's interesting. I was talking to friends about this just the night before last, and the abusive nature of it was not unlike, in many ways, not unlike prisons today. And I think, looking back on it, without thinking about it and without describing it or I can't find quite the right word, without articulating it, people were operating under the assumption that there was a separation in terms of quality of humanity or even humanity between the people who were incarcerated and the staff. Essentially, everybody operated on the assumption that the people that lived there were subhuman. If you had challenged them on that, they would have been upset. But if you looked at how they interacted with people, then it was continuous. There's a building that should have been preserved there. It was called Cedar Cottage. And that one had cells in the basement with chains in the walls and things carved in the walls from people that had been incarcerated there over the years. While some activities in the institution were done in a fairly open, free kind of way. I mean, we had football games and baseball games and that sort of thing, and we had summer camp. But much of the daily living stuff outside of that, the getting up and going to bed and eating and bathing and all of that, was handled very much the same way as it's done in prisons today. It was very regimented, and it really depended on the emotion of the staff person at the moment on how individuals and groups of individuals were treated. It's that old story of, if mama has a bad day, everybody has a bad day. Well, if the attendant had a bad day, whoever came next to that attendant had a bad day. And all of the staff were referred to by clients as Mr. or Mrs., rarely by name. And all the clients, the residents, the whatever label you want to apply to folks, were generally called by name, frequently last name. So it set up that dichotomy of of the keepers and the kept. And that caused me once to write a piece to author the line that I am not my brother's keeper. I'm not called to hold the keys. I am my brother's brother. And that sense of brotherhood just wasn't there in the institution. And if you think about the difference between what I've been describing and how the people within your family relate to each other, provided you don't have a really horrendous family, I think that probably explains it about as well as I can. But it's clear that any time, and if you want to find out what Fort Wayne State Hospital was like, spend some time inside of one of our worst prisons. In fact, we had something similar operating to Angola, the infamous Angola prison. We had people working a farm. It wasn't in operation during the time that I worked there, but at that time the farm at Muscatatuck was. People were working this farm for no wages, and the produce was being sold, or at least some of it. Much of it was being consumed by the institution, but some of it was being sold.
Well, that was, excuse me, one of the questions I was going to ask you, and you did answer, is did people have names? And you said they were referred to by their last name.
Last name and frequently nicknames that had been given them.
So it was not a very friendly. And
No.
I guess if there would be anything else I could ask you about that is, you said they were treated as if they were in the worst prison in Indiana, or worse than a prison.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the mentality? I mean, was it just that the attitude of the staff, some of the staff, was that people with disabilities were less than human? Where did that attitude come from? Did it come from just wanting to control? Do you have any thoughts on?
I think it was something that needed to be trained against and wasn't, because it's a kind of attitude that you see prevalent in society in general, but not by everybody. But it's the kind of thing. Well, isn't that sweet? When somebody does something that if it was an adult doing it, or a person who's not labeled with some kind of a disability, it would be saying, oh well, it's that attitude of some kind of difference between us and them that makes them less than. And as long as less than is considered attractive and pleasant and a good thing, that generally doesn't do much harm. But the problem that the less than attitude is there at all, when things get at all uncomfortable, when isn't that sweet, when the one that's done something that isn't that sweet does something demanding, then it's not too far from there to a slap, because they're not us.
That was good. So you had experience with several state hospitals in Indiana. Muscatatuck and Fort Wayne, right?
I did not work at Muscatatuck. I knew about it. In fact, my first wife had worked there. And it's also interesting that there was considerable difference, I think, between what went on in different institutions. One thing that I don't think ever happened at Fort Wayne that did happen at Muscatatuck, some of the staff sort of semi-adopted some of the residents and would take them to their family events, take them out for Christmas, and take them home with them on various times, and they became a little bit more like us, at least to those individual staff that did that. And I don't know of anybody doing that in Fort Wayne.
We heard stories of that too.
Yeah.
Well, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. If you could talk about, maybe you don't know the answer to this, the differences between the state hospitals around the state, and how it was decided who went to which state hospital? Was it geographic? Was if you had a seizure or epilepsy, you went to Newcastle? You know, how was it decided?
Determinations of who went to which state institution varied over the years. Early on, I'm not sure when Newcastle was established, but Newcastle, the minute it was established, when people had seizures, they were sent there. And I don't know if the woman is still alive or if you can find her. Christine Dahlberg might know. There was a woman that used to ride the bus with me when I went to work. Occasionally I would see her on the bus. And if you got in conversation with her, she would tell you how she spent 35 or 40 years in Newcastle because she once had a seizure in the 2nd grade. And they put her in Newcastle. She never had another seizure and she couldn't get out. And by the time she got out, she was marked. I mean, you could see her walking down the street and you know there's something weird about this person. And mostly it was a combination of behaviors learned in the institution and behaviors that she didn't have because she had no opportunity to learn them. But at some point, the other institutions, as I recall, depended on some combination of geography and diagnosis. People with multiple diagnoses often went to, as I recall, to Logansport or Richmond. And there was a children's hospital in Evansville, I believe. Silvercrest came along a good deal later. That was supposed to focus on, I believe, on autism. My memory of that's not very good.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you can think of about the institutions that we want to talk about before we move to a new topic?
Not especially, although if Bob Spalding is still alive and if you can find him, the last I knew he lived somewhere near Sue Ellen in that neighborhood in north central, somewhere around 14th or 15th and Central Avenue here in Indianapolis. Bob was the director of the Division on Mental Retardation for many years, and he would know a lot of what you're asking me about how things happened. I don't know that he had any inside experience in the institution as I did, but he was involved in a lot of those policy kinds of things.
Okay. Well, the next thing I want to talk to you about is the Governor's Planning Council. So what I'd like you to do is first just kind of talk about what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then, basically what's the role of the council, and then possibly some big grants that you were involved with and what changes they brought to Indiana. And then I'll ask you a few more questions about that.
Okay.
And I'm going to cough, so.
So am I.
Okay, we all have coughs. All right, so we'll start
After I left Fort Wayne State Hospital, I worked for a year at a local agency, and then in 1972, I hired on in the division on well, let's see, the names changed so much over the years. Then it was called the Division on Mental Retardation and Department of Mental Health under the Developmental Disabilities Federal Act. There were 3 consultants and 1 program manager. And I think I'm the only consultant left alive out of that bunch. It's tough on consultants in that program. And at that time, we started out, the role of the program under the federal agency was to, gosh, how do I put that? It was to be part of, they didn't call it change agentry then. That term hadn't been coined yet, but that's essentially what it was. Our job was to bring new ideas into the disabilities field in Indiana. In fact, that time it was primarily mental retardation, and they brought in epilepsy gradually, and then just kept expanding the definition of what disabilities the program was going to cover over time. But to begin with, we traveled all around the state working with mom and pop operations in cities and towns everywhere, and but we didn't mess with institutions much initially. And we had, it's one of those things that started out great and then had some unanticipated consequences. We brought modern management techniques and program management techniques to agencies that were made up primarily of volunteers. We began to introduce professionalism to small operations, and those operations grew. And there were a lot of great consequences of that. Agencies became more stable, they became better able to support themselves, they became more competent at doing what they were doing, they became more competent at fundraising. That was the upside. Some of the unanticipated consequences of professionalism were the business side of the picture, in that they developed administrative models that were more like local business. And then they developed administratively top-heavy models that were like larger local businesses, banks and insurance companies and whatnot. And then the top-level salaries began to eat badly into what should have been going into the lives of people they were serving. And they reached a point where executive directors of agencies of any size at all were, and sometimes a couple of levels beyond that, were, in my personal opinion, rewarded far beyond the kind of job they were doing, and kind of lost track of the notion of being a servant. We also, I'm not sure what order I'm in. My notes might help a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, we introduced, we were probably the prime mover in the development of group homes and around the state. And this was in the 70s and coming up to 1980. We piloted a lot of group homes in the state. And initially, that seemed like a really good idea. And later on, as the for-profit folks got involved, it became much less so. Mostly I can share anecdotes. I remember as we developed our division developed the regulations for group home operation. And I remember as we were developing those, I met with, I remember Jim Tays and John Hess and myself and some other folks met in Elkhart, and we're sorting out what to put in the regulations and trying to get as much what was then labeled normalization into them as we possibly could. And I think it was Jim Tays that prophesied that that he was afraid that the institutional model would be exported into the group homes by, and a lot of that proved true. And it was, again, people with good intentions, or at least they thought they had good intentions. Although there was one that I'm a little concerned about. We were working, the fire marshal's office was insisting that we put in these sprinkler systems and a restaurant type fire extinguisher in the kitchens and a variety of, and external fire escapes on every home. And I had an interview with a woman who at that time was second in command at the state fire marshal. And tried to explain what we were trying to do, and she responded, "We believe that the retarded should be institutionalized for their own good, and we're going to see to it that they are." And that's a quote. That we did succeed in modifying and getting the fire marshal to ease off on some things, but it took a lot of advocacy by a lot of people. And a couple of other things did a great deal of damage to that whole effort. Again, some of it was unintended consequences. It was demonstrated that community living could be done less expensively overall than institutional living. And then the powers that be, some combination of legislators and legislators' handpicked bureaucrats, declared that community living can be cheaper than institutions, therefore every community living setting has to be cheaper than an institution. And they also insisted that if institutions were going to close, then the state had to hire staff from those institutions in other places. So we wound up with people, and not always the most ideal people, who had been working in institutions coming to work in group homes. So you can see what started out to be a really great idea to help people with disabilities to become integrated into the community and have lives like the rest of us and become us instead of them. There'd be a little thing here and a little thing there, a little something else just begins to narrow down and tear it down. And a story that you probably know, this may have been somewhere in the late 80s or into the 90s, probably into the 90s, when as the progress towards community employment and community living moved forward, Johnson County ARC was a bit of a leader in that effort, and they had virtually closed their sheltered workshop. They got everybody jobs in the community, and they had, I think, maybe 3 people left that did not have a job in the community. And there were several group homes in the county, and they were taken over by a private for-profit operation. And immediately after the for-profit operation took it over, all of the adults in those group homes who had jobs in the community suddenly decided on the same day that they wanted to go back to the sheltered workshop. Now, for those who don't know, I'll explain the cause of that was that when you operated a facility with 6 or 7 or 8 people in it, and each of them have jobs in different places and their schedules are different, it means your staffing and your transportation costs run a little higher, and it puts pressure on your profit margin. But when everybody goes at the same time of the day to the sheltered workshop and comes home at the same time, you don't have to staff all day, and your transportation is narrowed down quite a lot. And that kind of thing has really wreaked havoc with the whole concept of group homes in the community.
I'm thinking Steve Savage told us a story about that in Johnson County.
Yeah, that happened during the time we were running that transportation shop.
So if I knew nothing about the Governor's Planning Council, and I didn't really know about their role, is there anything else you can think of that you would say along with some particular projects or big grants they had?
Well, this isn't in any chronological order, but
just an overview.
I think that we moved more and more into change agentry as opposed to just a project to start up, just startups. All the startups did accomplish change agentry in the communities where they happened up to a point, and then it reached the point where, okay, we've got group homes, we funded supported employment projects that got people out into regular jobs or something close to a regular job. We supported the supported living, which is not the same thing as group homes. It's having the supports you need to have your own home. The single most important project I think we ever funded, and one of the biggest ones and one of the longest running, was Partners in Policymaking, where we brought people with disabilities and family members of people with disabilities in for 8 fully funded weekends a year, over the course of a year, to learn about the field, to learn about their own disability, because many of them had a lot to learn about that, to learn about the system and how to operate within the system and how to relate to the system so that you could get what you really needed. And it had, as far as I know, still has great support. We had legislators who came in and talked to people about how to communicate with a legislator, taught people how to write to legislators. We had people from all the state agencies involved in any way with disabilities come in and describe their programs and help people identify, what they might really need in those programs. A little vignette in the early years of that program, we farmed out the administration of it for quite a number of years before bringing it back in-house. And we'd put out an RFP for the management of the program. And it wasn't going anywhere, and we couldn't figure out what was the problem. And we got called over to the State House to meet with the state budget director. They didn't want to allow the project to continue. And we said, I don't understand. It's 100% federal funded. It does not impact state funds. And finally, the budget director said, well, we can't have you going out and telling people about all of these state programs and benefits when we may not be funded well enough to provide them. And there was just silence. And finally I said, so are you telling me that this all these things we're talking about are it's public information and you want us to somehow try and keep it secret? And that kind of ended that conversation. One of the projects in the supported living area, the people in Fort Wayne got this great notion. There'd been all of this preparation, pre this, pre that, training for this, training for that, training for how to get around in the community, training for how to run your kitchen, training for how to dress, training for how to clean your bedroom. And yet people were still in the institution. And the pre wasn't going that far, and so finally the folks in Fort Wayne got this great notion: why don't we experiment with taking people just straight out of the institution into their own home with supports and see what happens? And several of us went, whoa, that's an interesting concept. Why didn't anybody think of that before? And so we funded it, and it was fabulous, and it's one of my favorite stories that I've probably told. I know I've told many people the story. There was a man that I knew when I worked at Fort Wayne State Hospital back in the 60s who had spasm kinds of issues. So he was flexing his muscles all the time, and he, as a consequence, built quite a physique and preferred the nickname of Mr. Muscles. Somebody put that on him and he liked it. Well, at the time I was working in the institution, Johnny Appleseed Agency in Fort Wayne was wanting to bring some adults out on a day program to the sheltered workshop. And I was amongst the people at the state hospital that said, this has never worked. These people can't do that kind of thing. That's ridiculous. And then that was somewhere in the 60s, and then somewhere in the midst of that project, I was at a conference in Atlanta, and up comes Mr. Muscles with the support staffer that was with him and invited me for a beer and wanted to tell me about his home that he was sharing with a partner. They were buying a house together. And that's what it's all about. That was really cool. And that's the kind of thing. Another one of the major projects that we supported. It only lasted a few years, but it did a lot. And that was the Community Transportation Initiative. And we basically copied the model off of Partners in Policymaking. And what we did there was invite communities to put together a team and send in people who were leadership in service agencies, somebody from city and county government, local financiers if we could get them. I don't know that we ever succeeded at that. And people with disabilities from the community to create a team to come and work out a plan for transportation development in their communities. And we hired Peter Schauer as the trainer for that. And it made changes to local transportation all over the state. The single most successful one that we did was when we managed to get both city and county government members in the training session, along with the rest of them. So there were, and it really brought a lot more transportation to a lot of people at a lot less cost than anybody thought would be possible.
Really good. You mentioned requests for proposals.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd like you to talk a little bit about is requests for proposals, the unsolicited projects where people would apply for money, you know, how the council dispensed of some money and how projects came about.
Oh dear.
And maybe that's not, you know, just whatever you can think of, but I know that there was 2 avenues to get funding from you all, and there would be the RFP process,
Mm-hmm.
and you do a broad-based announcement and people would apply. And then there was also an avenue of the unsolicited proposals where you would just submit an idea.
Right.
So I don't know if there's anything you want to say about either of those that would be noteworthy
Well,
or not.
The whole granting process over the years improved greatly, and I'm rather proud of a lot of what was done there. I remember when the program first started out, the folks running the epilepsy clinic at the Med Center basically bypassed all existing processes and sort of pirated the entirety of the funds for the first year or two. That was an interesting battle. I don't remember the details anymore, but it was something. There were, as in all fields, there were some folks that, because of certain credentials they carried, figured that gave them some sort of incontestable power. But we did develop a really good, solid, professional grants management system, whereby we determined our priorities and the kinds of things we wanted to accomplish, and then we put out requests for proposals to address those. We had those proposals reviewed. We had a blind review process that provided a very, very professional reviewing process, and as a consequence, we got generally high quality projects. We also had a process where people could submit unsolicited proposals for limited amounts of money. We did not have a wide open budget, so we didn't have wide open opportunities in that area. But these also met with a professional review process. And one of them resulted in one of our better projects that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the Fifth Freedom Project, which is it came in initially as an unsolicited proposal, and we looked at it, we got excited about it. I believe we involved the Institute, we got a bunch of people, people got excited, and we expanded on the initial concept. And that's developed it's developing a grassroots self-advocacy. There's a self-advocacy movement of one kind that involves a great deal of sponsorship by different supporting groups, and that is also one of our better projects, where people with disabilities have their own organization and there's quite a range of how strong these groups are, depending, as in my opinion, it depends on who the sponsor is. If it's a local service agency, they often become just a social club. But if it's somebody who, if the sponsor is somebody like the Institute or somebody that, in some cases, a local service agency that's got a different attitude, they become a part of the local social and political system and have some real clout in developing changes in their community that make life for people with disabilities more like life for the rest of us. But the Fifth Freedom Project is completely by and for people with disabilities, and it's modeled after, at least part of it is modeled after the work of Saul Alinsky. And people with disabilities form their own, basically their own advocacy group in the community and create their own agenda and push that agenda in the community. It's a project that I think for it to be truly successful, it needs more longer-term support than the council's ever going to be able to give it, and that's unfortunate. The way it is now, it's a pretty mixed bag. There are some communities that are very successful and some that are not at all, and I have no idea. I've been away from it for long enough now that it could have gone in any direction, and I wouldn't know what its current status is.
Okay. One of the things that I know that Indiana's council differs from in other states, I don't know if it's all states, is that you all have expanded your focus. It used to be people primarily with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and now the scope is people with mental illness, traumatic brain injury, that sort of thing. So I'm curious as to what brought that change about, and do you feel, since I think most of your funding comes from ADD, if there's risk in terms of funding or anything along those lines?
Well, I think in terms of expanding the definition, I mean, when it started out, it was mental retardation, epilepsy, and autism, I believe. And then we expanded, the definition was expanded to include mental illness and basically the whole field of the whole range of disabilities. Not entirely, but a great range of people with disabilities. And frankly, I credit Sue Ellen Jackson with most of that change. I think she saw appropriately that to develop the support base within the state, because the council, okay, it has funding from the feds, and it has support in state law and regulation. But you can have that and still not be very successful. You can have that and just shrivel up if you don't have other kinds of support. And to rely on the community of people with cognitive disabilities alone, or people with cognitive disabilities and people with epilepsy and autism, those three groups alone were not a broad enough base to accomplish the kind of change in the community that we wanted to do. Because the change has to happen at the local level, and Sue Ellen could see that in order for, where we want changes in neighborhoods, where we want changes in Muncie and Lafayette and Roanoke and, Angola, in order to do that, in Angola, how many people with cognitive disability or epilepsy or autism are there? Well, you don't have enough to get very far. But if you enable that group to ally and bring in people who are blind, who have who have visual impairments, people who have auditory impairments, people with mental illness, you begin to get a large enough body to actually have an impact on the community. So that's how that happened. I hesitate to speculate about ADD because it changes a little bit with every change in federal administration. And But and what happens every time the administration almost every time the administration changes, there's the effort to create an image of change, and so everybody and everything gets threatened and scared for a while, and then it calms down, and there are some moderate changes, and usually not for the worse, and things go on, whether that's good or bad.
But you didn't see any risk, or you don't see any risk in broadening the scope.
I don't. Some other people might, but to me it seems it's going to depend on whether the feds want to see success or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the current staff at the federal level. If they want to see your program succeed, then there's no risk. But if they didn't want it to succeed, if being able to demonstrate success increases flexibility.
So what have been some of the biggest changes in the field that you've seen in your tenure in the field?
Oh my. Closing of state hospitals, that's probably the biggest. And
wait a minute. They're not going to hear my questions. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. In terms of changes that I've seen, I've been in the field since '64, and it's now 2013. That's a lot longer than I care to remember. But the biggest change, the biggest visible change is the closing of institutions, and that process, as I've indicated in other parts of the discussion, was either intentionally or accidentally sabotaged by the way the funding was handled and failure to provide the level of community supports, especially for people with multiple diagnoses. But that's brought other changes. What I'm seeing that's a really big change is you can see it mostly in anecdotal kinds of things. I don't know that anybody's done the research on it yet, but community attitudes are changing. And if you look at community attitudes as the whole community, what is their attitude? I don't think that yields you much, because communities are made up of individuals, and I see lots and lots and lots of individual attitudes changing drastically. The way people relate to folks with disabilities, they really are becoming us, and that's the most important change.
Can you give me an example?
People with identifiable disabilities are working in visible places in the community, and nobody's paying any attention.
Good.
Nobody's noticing, good, bad, or otherwise. They're just another employee. They're just another person on the street. That's the easiest one to see. I see it on the internet. I see it in Facebook, where something about somebody with a disability will come up, and where in times past, you could readily expect a raft of patronizing kinds of remarks or hostile kinds of negative kinds of remarks. Now, if something patronizing or hostile shows up, everybody else is all over it. And that's a sign of change in community attitude.
Good. Okay, well, I know that you've shared with me before that your wife had a disability.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess one question that I would have is, did your personal experience with disabilities help drive your agenda, or help keep you motivated, or how did that affect the work that you did? And maybe it didn't.
Well, my late wife was a person with multiple disabilities. She had a birth anomaly, no right hand, and quite a bit of distortion in her left. She was also a diabetic from the time she was 9. and had heart disease, and she died at age 71. We lived with her disability for 39 years together, and it was very good. And I don't know what to say about how it affected my commitment to the work. I think I was, whatever change it made in me, I didn't notice particularly. I can't identify it. I do know there were some great stories. She had a myoelectric artificial hand, was shopping at Marsh one day, and the battery went dead while she was pushing the grocery cart. She had to take it up to the manager, take her arm out of it, and said, "Could you watch this while I go home and get another battery?" And she worked for the VA for a while in recreation, and it involved taking guys to the bowling alley on the weekend and driving a bus, and they wouldn't let her drive the bus. So she went out and got a chauffeur's license. They still wouldn't let her drive the bus. She thought it was because of her disability, so she went out and demonstrated she could drive the bus. No, it's because she was a woman. She became the first woman bus driver in the Veterans Administration.
Good for her.
It was the same year that we had the first woman driver in the 500, whenever that was. But she always encouraged me. So in that sense, but not because of her disability, just because of who she was.
Like I said, it was just a
Yeah.
random question. So in general, did things differ from one administration to the other across your tenure in terms of policies, funding,
Oh my, yes.
programs, and if so, how?
When I started with the whole funding process and the policy process changed a lot over the 35 years I was with the state, or 37, I guess. When I started out, the whole program was in the Department of Mental Health in the Division on Mental Retardation, and they had pretty much full use of the funds. And over time, initially that was fine because we did a lot of innovation. We did a lot of startups. We started up lots of children's programs. We even supported some Domen Delicato projects. And that was an interesting and overall unfortunate experience. But it was controlled by the Department of Mental Health and by that division. But over time, the division, as it supported community agencies, began to use more and more of the funds for ongoing support of community agencies, which basically was in violation of the federal requirements. And Sue Ellen came on as the director for the council. And the council, the state agency was one thing, and the council, while sort of captive of the state agency, was its own thing and developed its own administrative staff. It got an administrator and an associate. And that was Sue Ellen Jackson. Well, she succeeded in splitting the council entirely from the Department of Mental Health and taking the money with it. And that was quite an accomplishment. Prior to that, the funding, the overall funding gradually increased a little bit, like federal funds tend to do, but it was gradually losing its ability to accomplish change in the state and to accomplish innovation because it was being more and more soaked up in ongoing support. But once Sue Ellen managed to get the council free of the department, it became innovative once again. And at the same time, because of its innovation and because of its advocacy, different state administrations had a different approach to it. Some of them were threatened by it and attempted to either shut down or severely limit the council's ability to accomplish things. There were efforts to grab the funds one way or another from time to time. Almost every administration there would come a new effort to pull the funds away from the council's purpose and use them pull them into other parts of the state budget if possible. And I have to credit Sue Ellen for being able to successfully negotiate all those situations and to keep the council going. There were most of the stories I know about that aren't repeatable in public.
Well, and looking down the road, what do you see in terms of future services, supports, trends for providing meaningful lives for people with disabilities? What's that going to look like in the future?
Right now, I quite frankly have not addressed my brain to this since 2009.
Okay.
But as I do think about it, and since I got invited to be involved in this, I have thought about it quite a bit. It's a little scary. The upside, the good side is that I'm seeing more and more people getting involved with their neighbors. And that, as other things go along, is going to become more and more important, I think. The personal involvement by people with other individuals with disabilities. Right now, in terms of state and federally supported efforts to enable or to support people with disabilities to be part of us, looks pretty scary to me right now. It's the whole business of money is not looking good. There was something that just escaped me that I wanted to mention, and can't think what it is. Maybe it'll come back.
Okay. Well, if you had the power to provide training and or education to people that were new to this field and they were going to enter in a variety of capacities, what would be some things that they should know to do a good job supporting people?
Well, the absolutely most important thing to know is that every person that you meet is your brother or sister. And if you don't care to be a servant to your brother and sister, get out. Don't do this if you're not ready to be a servant. And that's at any level. Because you can only do harm to yourself and others if you can't be a servant. That would be the most important thing to learn. Beyond that, as much as I hate to think about it, Wolfensberger was a prophet. The man's pretty strange, but the things that he emphasized and the things that he prophesied have definitely come about, are continuing to come about, and so I would read Wolfensberger. I think it would be really cool if every person who is going to have direct contact in terms of serving people with disabilities would participate in Partners in Policymaking, because they're with direct contact with the people with disabilities and with all the aspects of the system. I think that would be one of the best training experiences they could get. It came back to me when I was talking about the future. One of the things that's grown out of all this effort, I have a friend who is a lead administrator with the Veterans Administration here in town, and she told me last night they had a program that for a while of foster or transitional homes for veterans with mental illness, and basically they were single women of middle age and above who took in 2 or 3 veterans with mental illness. and it was highly successful in terms of transitioning into the community. Well, most of those women died, and there wasn't the support. It kind of just died off. So they got in a proposal yesterday from some people for veterans foster care. Again, families who would be willing to take in up to 3 veterans. They call it medical foster care. So that, and that's exciting that that's happening. And I think if that kind of thing can catch on in some other areas, particularly people's concern about the closing of and lack of support for people with mental illness, that could have a great positive impact.
I've heard of that program. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Well, are there things that you wanted to talk about? Because we've pretty much gone through my list.
Let me look and see if I had anything else on my list.
Anything?
That's pretty well covers the territory.
Okay. Highlight or anything you wanted to talk about?
Well, the Mr. Muscle stories was one of the major highlights of my career. The Community Transportation Initiative was another one that went very well. Most of them are just personal stories, and my own. And no, I don't think I have any further things in that area to share.
Okay.
In general.
We did a great job.
Well,
I knew
thank
you
you.
would.
Yeah.
Well, what I didn't include in this is that I had my own disability to deal with in all of it. I was on one of the dynamics that affected my work and in some ways kept me at it was my own struggle. I dealt with depression and anxiety throughout my career. And fortunately, medication enabled me to survive in the career, but it was always a struggle, and that was part of the issue. I've always felt that if it hadn't been for that, I could have been a lot more effective and accomplished a great deal more. But that's water over the dam and under the bridge.
Well, you were very effective at the planning council. I mean, I remember you from the early days, and I have told Peg this. I said, in the early days, you could call people. I could call Paul and say,
Mm-hmm.
are there any grants coming out
Yeah.
around this and this and this? Or you would say, hey, I remember talking to you about this. We're going to be putting out an RFP, get your ducks in a row. Or,
Mm-hmm.
and I could say, well, I don't understand this part. And you would say, well, here's what you need to look up, or, come to a meeting, or this or that. It was so much easier.
Yeah.
I mean, it truly
I'll
was
be
in terms
darned.
of just being able to get information and have someone you could call and they could give you an answer.
Well, I'm glad to hear stuff like that because I often, I had no idea that, there were so many, at least the last 10 years when things changed. The early part when I was traveling a lot and taking out new ideas and introducing new stuff and startups and training projects, that was fun. That was really enjoyable. But as it moved more into bean counting and making sure they don't steal anything and yada, 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 and then as the state, different elements in the state, we became a thorn in the side of the state because you could not question that what we were doing was right, but it cost money. And when right comes up against cost money, it's always a conflict, and there's always an effort to do away with whoever's advocating what's right.
Mm-hmm.
And the pressure on us was just began worse and worse and worse to where we had to, when I started, there was no such thing as a timesheet. Everybody knew you were doing everything you possibly could, and it was more than anybody could do. And then we had people assigned to sabotage us. And then we had timesheets, and we had more timesheets. And then you had to fill out every 15 minutes what you were doing, what goal and objective it related to, and on and on and on. And it got to where I didn't even want to come to work anymore. It was just, I had enough trouble with depression and anxiety, and it just made it worse. So, yeah, but it is good to hear that some of those things really help people out, because
It was great. I mean, that was in the 80s and early 90s, and I can remember calling you. And I didn't know Sue Ellen and Christine near as well as I knew you. But I could call you and ask you a question, or like I said, I could call you and say, hey, when's this RFP coming, or do you have anything in the
the funny
pipeline?
thing is, many times when you or somebody would call me, and I'd say, I'll get back to you, I go talk to Christine, and then I'd call you back.
Right, hey, we have
Christine-
an idea.
Christine was our walking encyclopedia. That woman just never ceased to amaze me, and what she managed to amass in her head and have immediately available.
Produced by Center on Aging and Community, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University. Funded in part by a grant from the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. Copyright 2017, the Trustees of Indiana University.